I built everything with my own hands. My wife served me divorce papers while I was still in a hospital bed, told me she didn't marry someone she'd spent her life taking care of. She walked out, took half the business. 4 months later, standing in a courtroom on metal leg braces, I watched the judge open a sealed envelope. My wife shot to her feet, slammed both palms on the table and screamed, "That is not possible! How did a cripple and that girl get their hands on those documents?" I'm so grateful you're here. To help us connect, please comment below, letting me know where you are watching, from what city or country are you in. Also keep in mind that this narrative contains fictionalized elements for educational and entertainment value. Any similarity to actual individuals or places is accidental, but the core message remains highly valuable for your life. I built Callaway Ironworks with a borrowed socket wrench, $400 in a coffee can, and hands that had never learned how to stop moving. That was the spring of 1983. I was 26 years old, renting a 2-car garage on the east side of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, taking on any fabrication job that came through the door. Exhaust brackets, custom trailer hitches, gate hardware for horse farms out in Forsyth County. It didn't matter what it was. If it was metal and someone needed it, shaped, bent, cut, or welded, I was their man. My father had been a machinist for 31 years at a textile equipment plant that shut down the year I turned 18. He didn't cry when they handed him his final check. He drove home, hung his work apron on the hook by the back door, and sat down at the kitchen table. He looked at his hands for a long time. Then he looked at me and said, "Robert, don't ever let somebody else decide when you're done." I never forgot that. By 1989, I had moved out of the rented garage and into a proper building on Industrial Drive. 12,000 square feet, 3 overhead cranes, 8 full-time employees. The sign above the door was the first thing I ever welded on that property, thick block letters, slightly uneven because I was rushing and my hands were shaking with excitement. Callaway Iron Works. I stood in the parking lot and looked at it until Evelyn honked from the car and told me we were going to be late for dinner. Evelyn. We had met at a church potluck in the fall of 1986. She was wearing a yellow dress and carrying a casserole dish that smelled like rosemary chicken, and she laughed at something Pastor Glenn said before I even had the chance to introduce myself. That laugh stopped me cold. It was the kind of laugh that made a room feel warmer just by being in it. We were married 11 months later. For a long time, I believed we were building something together. She handled the office side of the business, invoicing vendor contracts, payroll materials, procurement. I handled the floor. It was a clean division that worked well for nearly 2 decades. On Friday evenings, we'd sit on the back porch with sweet tea and go over the week. She'd tell me what orders were coming in. I'd tell her what the floor needed. We disagreed sometimes, but we always worked it out before the porch light came on. Brandon was born in 1992. He was a loud baby who grew into a loud teenager, who grew into a man who seemed to believe the world owed him something he could never quite name. I tried with that boy. Lord knows I tried. When he was 9 years old, he wrote me a letter after I spent a Saturday afternoon teaching him to ride his bicycle in the driveway. He fell 7 times. The 8th time he made it to the end of the block without stopping. He came back red-faced and grinning, and that evening he slid a folded piece of paper under my bedroom door. I still have it. The handwriting was crooked and he'd spelled hero as hero, but the meaning was clear enough. I put it in my wallet that night and never moved it. Lily came along 4 years later in 1996, and she was different from the first week. Quiet where Brandon was loud, steady where he was restless. She used to follow me into the shop on Saturday mornings when she was barely tall enough to see over the workbench, pulling on my sleeve to ask what every tool was called. By the time she was 12, she could identify a TIG weld from a MIG weld by the bead pattern alone. I never taught her that. She just watched and learned. Those were good years, genuinely good. The business grew steadily through the late 90s and into the 2000s. We hired more machinists, added a second shift, picked up contracts with 3 regional construction firms. Evelyn managed the accounts with precision. The numbers always came back clean, or so I believed. On Sunday mornings, we walked across the street to Pastor Glenn Whitaker's church, the same little Methodist congregation that had hosted the potluck where I met Evelyn. Glenn had been our neighbor on Ridgefield Lane for 22 years. He was the kind of man who showed up with a casserole when someone's father died and stayed to help wash the dishes afterward. His wife Eleanor made the best peach cobbler in Forsyth County, and she always brought an extra pan for us on holidays. I used to think the life I had built was solid, the kind of solid that takes decades to construct and can withstand almost anything. I was wrong about almost anything. The week before, everything changed. I walked the full floor of the shop on a Tuesday afternoon, the way I always did, checking the overhead cranes, inspecting the staging areas, running my hand along the support columns, out of habit more than necessity. I stopped beneath the second floor assembly platform and looked up at the scaffolding along the east wall. New steel, or so the materials log had said. Something made me pause. I couldn't have told you what. A feeling, maybe. The kind that settles in the back of a man's neck when 30 years of experience notices something his eyes haven't quite identified yet. I stood there for a moment, looking up. Then my foreman called me back to the office about a contract dispute, and I went. 3 days later, the scaffolding on the east wall came down, and it took me with it. The first thing I heard when I came back to consciousness was the sound of a ventilation fan turning slowly somewhere above me. Not the shop fans, those were loud industrial, the kind that rattled the ceiling panels on hot afternoons. This fan was quieter, steady, the kind that runs in rooms where people aren't supposed to make too much noise. I tried to move my legs. Nothing happened. Not pain, not yet. Just absence. The kind of stillness that sits below the threshold of sensation and makes a man understand before his mind is fully awake that something has changed in a way that cannot be quickly undone. I opened my eyes, white ceiling tiles, fluorescent light. The smell of antiseptic so sharp it felt like it had edges. An IV line taped to the back of my left hand. And at the foot of the bed, a young doctor with dark circles under his eyes, holding a clipboard and watching me with the careful expression of a man who has delivered difficult news before and has not yet decided exactly how to begin. "Mr. Calloway," he said. "I'm Dr. Hensley. You're at Forsyth Medical Center. You've been unconscious for about 14 hours. I stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then I said, "My legs." He pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. That was when I knew it was serious. Doctors who are about to tell you something manageable stay standing. The scaffolding collapse had caused severe injuries to my left leg and heavily impacted the joint structure in both knees. The force of the fall had also affected my lower spine, not enough to cause long-term immobility, he was careful to say, but enough to disrupt signaling to my legs in ways that would take months to fully understand. I would need orthopedic braces on both legs, rigid metal frames that attach from mid-thigh to just below the ankle, designed to stabilize the joints while the bone and tissue healed. Physical therapy would begin as soon as the swelling reduced. Recovery was possible. He said that word carefully, the way people say words they mean but don't want you to hold them to. "How long?" I asked. "To walk without assistance." He paused. 12 to 18 months, possibly longer. I looked down at my legs beneath the thin hospital blanket. I couldn't feel them the way I usually could. There was sensation, a dull pressurized ache that ran from my hips to my ankles, but it was muffled like sound coming through a closed door. 40 years of standing on a shop floor, 40 years of walking the length of that building every morning before the crew arrived, running my hand along the equipment, checking that everything was where it should be. And now I was lying in a bed in Forsyth Medical Center, being told that standing up was going to require a timeline and a treatment plan. I pressed my lips together and looked at the window. Outside the sky over Winston-Salem was the flat gray of a February afternoon. A single oak tree was visible at the edge of the parking lot, bare and patient, the way trees get in winter when they're simply waiting for conditions to change. I understood exactly how that tree felt. Frank Delgado came to see me on the first evening. He was still wearing his work clothes, heavy canvas pants, steel-toed boots, the green Callaway Ironworks jacket, with his name stitched above the left pocket. He stood in the doorway of my hospital room, with his hat pressed against his chest and his eyes red at the corners, and he said, "Boss, I'm so sorry. I was the first one to reach you. You weren't moving, and I thought—" His voice broke apart, and he stopped talking. He pressed his lips together hard and stared at the floor. "Frank," I said. He looked up. "You kept the crew calm." He nodded. "Yes, sir. Called 911, cleared the area, kept everybody away from the collapse zone until the paramedics arrived." "Then you did your job," I told him. "Go home and sleep." He stood there another moment, turning his hat in his hands, and I could see something working behind his eyes that I couldn't quite read. Then he nodded once more, said, "Yes, sir," again, and left. I didn't sleep much that first night. I lay in the adjustable hospital bed with the rails up and the room dim, and I ran through everything I could remember about the east wall scaffolding. I had inspected it myself, not 3 weeks before the accident. The uprights had looked solid. The cross bracing had looked correct. The platform boards had been new lumber. Nothing had seemed wrong, which meant something had gone wrong after my inspection. The thought sat in the back of my mind like a splinter, not large enough to demand immediate attention, but persistent enough that I couldn't fully ignore it. On the second day, the physical therapist came in and introduced herself as a woman named Gail, who had the cheerful, no-nonsense manner of someone who had spent 20 years helping people learn to do things their bodies no longer wanted to do. She explained the brace system in detail, how the hinge joints at the knee would allow controlled movement while protecting the damaged ligaments, how the thigh cuffs and calf cuffs would distribute weight more evenly during the early stages of weight bearing, how the whole apparatus worked together to give the body a framework to heal within. She showed me photographs of men and women in similar braces walking, standing, climbing stairs. The hardware is heavy, she told me honestly. You'll feel it for the first few weeks, but your body adapts faster than you think. I looked at the photographs for a long time. Then I looked at her and said, "When do we start?" She smiled like she had been hoping I would ask that. That evening, I looked toward the door every time I heard footsteps in the hallway. Evelyn had called twice, brief conversations, practical questions about insurance paperwork and who was covering the shop. She had not come in person yet. I told myself she was managing things at home. I told myself there were good reasons. On the third morning, I heard her heels on the linoleum floor of the corridor, a sharp, deliberate sound I had known for 35 years. I turned my head toward the door, and I noticed before anything else that her left hand was bare. The wedding ring she had worn since 1987, a thin gold band with a small diamond cluster that I had saved for 8 months to afford, was gone. My chest tightened around something I could not name. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. She didn't knock. In 35 years of marriage, Evelyn had never knocked before entering a room I was in. It had never bothered me before. That morning, the way she pushed the door open, 2 fingers barely. Any pressure like the room had already stopped belonging to me made something cold move through my chest. She was dressed well. That was the first thing I noticed. Not hospital visit clothes, not the kind of thing a woman throws on when she rushes to her husband's bedside. She was wearing the charcoal blazer she saved for meeting with vendors, her hair done, her earrings in. She looked like she had somewhere more important to be afterward. She stopped at the foot of the bed and looked at me the way a person looks at a piece of furniture they're trying to decide whether to keep. "How are you feeling?" she asked. The words were right. The tone was the problem. It had the same quality as asking about the weather, a question you ask because silence would be awkward, not because you want the answer. "Like a scaffold fell on me," I said. She didn't smile. She reached into the leather bag on her shoulder and pulled out a manila envelope thick with papers and set it on the blanket covering my legs. The weight of it was almost nothing. It felt like it weighed 40 pounds. "I've already signed everything," she said. "The attorney handled the filing yesterday. You just need to add your signature and we can move forward without it becoming complicated." I looked at the envelope. I looked at her hand resting on the bed rail, her left hand bare where that thin gold band had lived for 35 years. Then I looked at her face. "Evelyn," I said slowly, "I am in a hospital bed. I'm aware of that, Robert. I can't feel my legs properly. The doctors say that's temporary. You came here," I said, "on the 3rd day while I'm still on IV medication to hand me divorce papers." She straightened her shoulders. When she spoke again, her voice had the flat, certain quality of someone delivering a prepared statement. "I married you to build a life together, to enjoy the years we earned. I did not sign up to spend whatever time I have left managing a man who can't stand up on his own. The medical bills alone." She stopped and pressed her lips together. "I won't do it, Robert. I've made my decision." The room felt like it had lost oxygen. I had loved this woman for 35 years. I had built everything I had with her name on half of it. I had sat across from her on a back porch every Friday evening for decades and believed we were in it together, whatever it turned out to be. I stared at the envelope on my blanket and didn't touch it. The door swung open again. Brandon filled the frame, broad-shouldered, expensive jacket, the particular expression he wore when he believed he held an advantage over someone. He glanced at the envelope, then at me, and something like satisfaction moved across his face. "Mom tell you, he said. She told me. He walked in without being invited and stood beside her. Look, Dad, it's better this way. Clean break. The shop's been bleeding overhead for 2 quarters anyway. Mom sells it. We clear the debt, everybody moves on. He paused. I already talked to a locksmith. Had the locks changed at the house this morning. Just practical given the circumstances. My hands gripped the bed rail. What Brandon had just done, changing the locks on a marital home, while a divorce filing was pending before any court had issued a property order, was not simply rude. It was legally actionable. A man who had run a business for 40 years understood that joint marital property cannot be unilaterally controlled by one party before a judge divides it. He had just handed a future attorney a gift and didn't know it. But I said nothing about that yet. I looked at my son, my 32-year-old son in his expensive jacket, and I thought about a 9-year-old boy falling off a bicycle 7 times in a driveway and getting up every single time, and the crooked handwriting on a folded piece of paper that said, "You are my hero." The gap between that boy and this man was the saddest distance I had ever tried to measure. The door hit the wall hard. Lily came through it with her coat still half on her face, flushed from running, her eyes taking in the scene in about 2 seconds flat. The envelope on the blanket, her mother's blazer, her brother's satisfied posture, my grip on the bed rail. She pointed at Evelyn, and her voice came out shaking with fury. "What did you do?" "Lily," Evelyn started. "What did you do?" She crossed the room and grabbed my hand with both of hers, squeezing hard enough that I could feel the warmth of it all the way up my arm. She turned to face her mother, with tears running straight down her face and her chin absolutely steady. "He is in a hospital bed. He cannot walk, and you came here to serve him papers. This is between your father and me. It stopped being just between you two the second you walked in here with that envelope." She looked at Brandon. "And you changed the locks. That's his house. That's his name on the deed, same as hers. You can't do that." Brandon rolled his eyes. "It's already done. Then it'll get undone in court." She turned back to me. Her voice dropped and something in it steadied. "Dad, listen to me. I'm not going anywhere. Whatever they think is happening here, it is not happening. You hear me?" I looked at my daughter, 28 years old, coat half on, furious and unbreakable, and something shifted inside my chest. Not hope exactly. Something older and more durable than hope. "Lily," I said quietly, "do you still have the spare key to the office at the shop?" She blinked. The fury on her face shifted into something sharper, focused. "Yes," she said. "I never gave it back." She went on a Thursday night 2 weeks after the accident, when the shop had been locked up for hours, and the parking lot on Industrial Drive was empty, except for a single security light, casting a pale yellow circle on the asphalt. She called me from the car before she went in. "I'm outside," she said. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the engine still running. She hadn't turned it off yet. "You don't have to do this tonight," I told her. "Yes, I do." A pause. "If Evelyn sends someone to clean out that office before we get there, whatever's inside is gone. You know that." I knew that. "Okay," I said. "The materials procurement files are in the bottom drawer of the gray cabinet left side of the desk. The vendor contracts are in the accordion folder on the top shelf. Red tabs are active, blue tabs are closed. If there's anything that looks like it was handled separately from the standard filing system, anything that Evelyn kept in her own folders rather than the shared system, I want to know about it. And the desk drawers. All of them," I said, "especially the one that locks." She was quiet for a moment. "You knew about a locked drawer." I knew she had one. I never asked what was in it. I should have. I heard her take a breath. Then the engine cut off. The spare key was exactly where it had always been on the ring she had kept since she was 19 years old, the year I first let her open up the shop on Saturday mornings so I could sleep an extra hour. She had never returned it, and I had never asked. At the time, it was simply the kind of thing that happens in families where trust is assumed. Now I understood it had been the most important thing I ever forgot to take back. She called me again 20 minutes later, whispering, "I'm in. The alarm panel accepted the code." "Good. Go to the cabinet first." I lay in my hospital bed in the dark, the phone pressed against my ear, and listened to the sound of drawers opening and pages turning and Lily's quiet breathing as she worked. Outside my window, the parking lot of Forsyth Medical Center was empty and still. A nurse had come in an hour ago to check my vitals, and I had pretended to be asleep so she wouldn't ask questions. "Dad?" Her voice changed. What did you find? The materials log for the East Wall project. Papers shuffling. The approved vendor for the structural steel. It's not anyone we've used before. I don't recognize the company name at all. Tri-State Fabrication Solutions. Pull the purchase order. More shuffling. Then a sharp intake of breath. Dad, the steel specification on the purchase order is grade A36. She paused. But the approved spec for load-bearing scaffold support in the original project file is grade A572. I closed my eyes. Grade A36 is standard mild steel, inexpensive, widely available, used for general construction. Grade A 572 is high-strength structural steel, significantly more resistant to stress loading, the correct material for scaffolding, that carries human weight on an active industrial floor. The difference in cost between the two is substantial. The difference in performance under pressure is the difference between holding and failing. Someone had approved cheaper, weaker steel for scaffolding that working men stood on every day. The signature on the purchase order approval was Evelyn Calloway. "Photograph everything?" I said. My voice came out quieter than I intended. "Every page of that log, every purchase order with her signature. Don't move anything, don't reorganize anything, put it all back exactly as you found it." "There's more," Lily said. "Tell me." The locked drawer. I found the key taped to the underside of the middle drawer. She must have forgotten. I used to watch her open it when I was little. A pause. "Dad, there's an insurance document in here. A life insurance policy." "We have life insurance. We've had it for years." This one was amended. Her voice had gone very careful. The beneficiary designation was changed 6 weeks before the accident. Another pause, longer this time. "The payout amount is $2,400,000. The listed beneficiaries are Evelyn Calloway and Brandon Calloway in equal shares." The room seemed to get smaller. I had taken out a life insurance policy in 1994, a standard term policy with Evelyn as sole beneficiary, something every business owner with a family does, nothing unusual about it. I had not looked at that document in years. I had not known it had been amended. I had not known the amount had been increased or that Brandon had been added. 6 weeks before a scaffolding collapse that should have killed me. "Lily," I said. "Dad, I'm shaking." "I know. Take photographs of every page. The amendment date, the signature page, the beneficiary designation, all of it." I kept my voice level because one of us had to. "Then lock the drawer, put the key back where you found it, and walk out the same way you came in. Don't turn on any more lights than you need." I heard her moving the quiet click of the drawer, locking the rustle of her coat. Then she stopped. "Dad," her voice dropped to almost nothing. "There are footsteps outside, in the hallway. Someone just turned the corridor light on." My hand tightened on the phone. The person in the hallway turned out to be Eddie Marsh, the overnight security guard who had worked the Industrial Drive building for 11 years, and who, according to Lily, smelled strongly of coffee and moved like a man in no particular hurry. She pressed herself behind the filing cabinet in the dark, held her breath for 90 seconds, and listened to his footsteps pass the office door without slowing. His flashlight swept briefly under the door gap. Then he moved on down the corridor, humming something low and tuneless, and Lily stayed where she was for another 3 minutes before she trusted her legs enough to move. She called me from the parking lot, still whispering even though she was outside. "I got out," she said. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in 20 minutes. "The photographs, every page, I'm sending them to your email right now." "Good girl," I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. She laughed a little, the kind of laugh that comes out when fear releases, and relief hasn't fully arrived yet. "Get some sleep, Dad? We'll figure out the next part tomorrow." I didn't sleep. I spent the rest of that night on my phone, reading through everything she had sent. By the time the breakfast cart came around at 6:30 in the morning, I had looked at those photographs enough times that the numbers were fixed permanently in my memory. $2,400,000, 6 weeks. Evelyn's signature on a steel specification that should have kept working men safe. I asked Lily to make 2 calls the next morning, one to a veteran colleague who had recommended an attorney in Winston-Salem, and one to the Forsyth County Courthouse to request information about emergency property protection orders that could prevent Evelyn from disposing of business assets while the divorce proceeding was pending. The second call was about buying time. The first call was about finding the right person. Marcus Webb's office was on the 7th floor of a building on West 5th Street in downtown Winston-Salem, 6 blocks from the courthouse and 3 floors above a sandwich shop that apparently did enough lunchtime business to keep the elevator perpetually occupied. Lily pushed my wheelchair off the elevator on the 7th floor, and we found the office at the end of a carpeted hallway lined with framed bar association certificates and a single window that looked out over the rooftops toward Truist Stadium. Webb himself was not what I had expected. The colleague who recommended him had used the phrase tough but fair, which in my experience could describe either a good attorney or a moderately trained border collie. Webb was in his early 50s, thick through the shoulders, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and a desk covered in the organized chaos of a man who knew exactly where everything was, despite appearances suggesting otherwise. He stood when we came in and shook my hand with a firm grip that didn't adjust for the wheelchair, which I appreciated more than I could easily explain. He read through the photographs on a tablet Lily handed him, without saying anything for several minutes. When he finished, he set the tablet down, took his glasses off his forehead, and looked at me directly. "Before we go any further," he said, "I need to tell you something." "All right, I know Evelyn." He said it the way a man says something he has been deciding whether to say. "Not well and not recently. 15 years ago, I was a younger attorney handling a contract dispute involving a supplier she had worked with through the shop. She provided testimony that was credible, detailed, and ultimately helped my client prevail. I have not had any professional or personal contact with her since." He paused. "Under the American Bar Association's rules of professional conduct, I am required to disclose any prior relationship with an opposing party before accepting representation. I am disclosing it now. If you want a different attorney, I will give you 3 names right now, all of whom are excellent." I looked at him for a moment. "Do you think that relationship affects your ability to represent me effectively?" I asked. "No," he said. "But I'm not the one who gets to make that determination unilaterally. You are." "Then I want you," I said, "because you know how she thinks." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the particular look of a man who has just decided to give something everything he has. He put his glasses back on and pulled a legal pad toward him. "Tell me everything," he said. "From the beginning." I talked for nearly 2 hours. Webb asked questions that cut straight to the points that mattered: the timeline of the insurance amendment, the specification discrepancy in the materials, log Brandon's access to the storage facility, the lock change on the marital home before any court order had been issued. He made notes in a handwriting so small I couldn't read it from across the desk. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. "Robert," he said, "this is not simply a divorce proceeding anymore. What you've described, the materials, fraud, the insurance amendment, the timing, these are elements that a prosecuting attorney looks for when building a criminal case." He brought his gaze back down. "I can handle the civil side, the property, the marital assets, the divorce itself, but I need someone working the other angle simultaneously." He picked up his phone. "There's a detective with the Forsyth County Sheriff's Office who I've worked alongside before. Her name is Carol Simmons. She is meticulous, she does not cut corners, and she is genuinely difficult to mislead." He looked at me over his glasses. "She's also going to want to go back to that shop floor. Tell her to bring someone from the engineering division," I said. Webb dialed the number from memory. While it rang, he looked at the photographs still pulled up on the tablet. Evelyn's signature on the steel specification, neat and unhurried, the handwriting of someone who had not expected anyone to look twice. "Carol," he said when the line connected. "It's Marcus. I need you to take a look at something." Webb called me 4 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon, while I was in the middle of a physical therapy session that involved trying to lift my left leg 6 inches off a padded table without making a sound that would concern the nurses in the hallway. I made the sound anyway when I saw his name on the screen. "Can you talk?" he asked. "Give me 1 minute." I told Gail I needed to take the call. She handed me a towel, pulled the curtain around the therapy bay, and gave me the particular look of a healthcare professional who has learned not to ask questions about things that aren't strictly medical. I pressed the phone to my ear. "Go ahead." "Simmons went to the shop yesterday with a forensic structural engineer named Raymond Hess. He has 30 years of experience doing failure analysis on industrial equipment. He's testified as an expert witness in 14 cases in the Western District of North Carolina alone." Webb paused. He looked at what remained of the east wall scaffolding for about 40 minutes. Then he looked at Simmons and said, and I'm quoting here, that there was no scenario in which this was an accident. I set my jaw and said nothing. The load-bearing bolts on the primary upright connections, the ones that anchor the scaffold frame to the wall and carry the weight of the platform above 3 of the 4, had been deliberately loosened. Webb's voice stayed level and precise the way it got when he was delivering information he wanted me to receive clearly. Not stripped, not corroded, not fatigued from repeated stress loading, loosened. The thread engagement on each one had been backed off by hand, carefully enough to leave the bolt appearing secure under casual visual inspection, but with only 20 to 30% of the required clamping force actually present. Under normal daily load conditions, the structure might have held for days or weeks. Under the load conditions of that particular morning, with the crew running the overhead line and the additional vibration from the compressor units, it failed. The therapy bay felt very small. Raymond Hess will put all of that in a written report, Webb continued. Signed, dated, admissible. He's done it before, and he knows exactly how it needs to be structured for a North Carolina court. The access log, I said. The storage room where the tools are kept. Simmons pulled it this morning. The building management system logs every card swipe entry and exit with a timestamp. A brief pause. 3 people accessed the structural hardware storage room in the 72 hours before the accident. You on Monday afternoon during your regular floor walk. Frank Delgado, Tuesday morning at 7:43, which matches the start of his shift. And Brandon Calloway Tuesday evening at 9:17. After close of business, after the crew had gone home. I thought about my son in his expensive jacket standing in my hospital room 3 days after that Tuesday night, telling me the shop had been bleeding overhead for 2 quarters, and that it was better this way. The ease of it. The practiced ease of a man who believed he had already won. Does Simmons think the access log is enough? I asked. She thinks it establishes opportunity. Combined with Hess's analysis, establishing that the loosening was deliberate rather than accidental, and combined with the insurance amendment establishing motive, she believes the evidentiary picture is becoming coherent. Webb chose his next words carefully. She also found something else. The contractor who supplied the substandard steel tri-state fabrication solutions, the company listed on Evelyn's purchase order. Simmons ran the business license. It was registered with the North Carolina Secretary of State 8 days before Evelyn signed the purchase order, and it was formally dissolved 14 days after the accident. The company had existed for one purpose and one transaction. Does Simmons know who registered it? I asked. She's working on that. The registered agent is a formation service that handles dozens of LLCs a month. It takes time to get behind the paperwork. He paused. But here's what she does know. The phone number listed as the primary contact on the tri-state fabrication registration documents is a prepaid cell number. She pulled the call records from the carrier. That number made exactly 6 outgoing calls during the entire period the company existed. The last call it ever made was placed at 8:41 in the morning on the day the contractor's equipment was last seen at the shop address. Another pause longer this time. The number it called was Brandon Calloway's personal cell phone. I closed my eyes. Outside the curtain, I could hear the low sounds of the therapy floor equipment, moving voices murmuring, someone being coached through a set of exercises with quiet encouragement. Ordinary sounds of a place where people were working to get back what they had lost. I pressed my fingers against my left thigh, feeling the shape of the brace beneath my gym shorts, the hard edges of the metal frame that was holding my leg together, while the bone tried to remember how to be whole. Robert, Webb said, "Are you still there?" "I'm here." She said his name once, just once, Brandon Calloway, and then she told me she was going to need more time before she was ready to take what she had to the district attorney's office. He cleared his throat. But she also said she didn't think she was going to need much more. I opened my eyes and looked at the curtain in front of me, the pale blue fabric, the thin light coming through it from the therapy room beyond. "Marcus?" I said. "Yeah. Tell her to take whatever time she needs, and tell her thank you." There was a brief silence on the line. Then Webb said, "There's one more thing she wants. Before she goes to the DA, she wants to know if there's anyone else who might have had direct knowledge of what was planned. Someone close to the operation. Someone who might have been persuaded to look the other way." The name came to me immediately. I hadn't let myself think it until that moment, but the image was already there. Frank Delgado in my hospital room doorway hat, pressed to his chest, eyes red at the corners, turning that hat in his hands with the slow rotation of a man carrying something heavier than grief. "I think I might know someone," I said. He came on a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks after the accident, standing on the front step of Lily's apartment on Clover Street, with his work cap pressed flat against his chest, and the particular expression of a man who has been rehearsing what he wants to say for so long that the words have started to feel worn smooth from handling. Lily called me before she opened the door all the way. "Dad," she said, her voice low and careful. "Frank Delgado is here." I had been sitting at the small kitchen table in her spare bedroom, working through the stack of documents Webb had sent over both legs, stretched out in front of me in their braces, a cup of coffee going cold at my elbow. I had been discharged from Forsyth Medical Center 4 days earlier than the doctors had recommended if I was being honest. But the hospital room had started to feel like something I was losing time inside of, and Lily had converted her spare room into something close enough to a recovery space that the discharge physician had eventually stopped arguing. "Let him in," I said. I heard the door open. I heard Lily say his name not warmly, but not unkindly either, the way you speak to someone you are not yet sure deserves your warmth. I heard Frank say, "Miss Lily, I'm sorry to come without calling. I wasn't sure I'd go through with it if I gave myself too much time to think." When he came into the kitchen doorway, he looked older than I remembered. Not the weak 6 weeks don't age a man that way. It was the weight of something he had been carrying that had done it. His shoulders sat differently. His eyes had the look of a man who had not been sleeping through the night. He looked at my legs in their braces for a long moment without speaking. Then he looked at my face. "Boss," he said. His voice fractured on the single syllable, and he pressed his lips together hard and stared at the floor. "Sit down, Frank," I said. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, cap in his hands, turning it with the same slow rotation I had noticed in the hospital doorway. Lily stood in the kitchen entrance with her arms crossed and her eyes sharp, watching him, the way she watched anything she hadn't fully decided about yet. "Tell me," I said. He took a breath that seemed to cost him something. Then he told me. 3 months before the accident, during the routine quarterly safety inspection of the east wall assembly area, Frank had identified an issue with the scaffold anchoring system. Not the bolts that came later, but the wall anchor plates, the steel brackets bolted into the concrete block that the entire scaffold frame hung from. 2 of the 4 plates had shown early signs of stress-cracking hairline fractures that weren't dangerous yet, but would need to be addressed before the next heavy-use cycle. Standard procedure required a written report filed with the shop owner and a repair timeline established within 30 days. Frank had written the report. He had brought it to Evelyn because Evelyn handled the administrative side, and Robert was traveling to Charlotte that week for a supplier meeting. Evelyn had read it in front of him without expression. Then she had looked up and asked him how much it would cost to fix. He had given her an estimate approximately $14,000 for materials and labor. She had nodded and said she would review it with Robert when he returned. She never did. 2 weeks later, she had called Frank into her office and closed the door. She had slid an envelope across the desk. Inside was $3,500 in a bank cashier's check made out to cash. She had told him the anchor plate issue was being addressed through the regular maintenance budget, and that his report had been noted but would not be filed with the county inspection office because it would trigger a mandatory work stoppage during the review period, and the shop had contracts it couldn't afford to delay. She had looked at him calmly and said the check was for his discretion. Frank had taken it. His wife had been 6 weeks into a treatment cycle for rheumatoid arthritis that their insurance covered only partially, and the out-of-pocket costs had been eating through their savings at a rate that frightened him. He had told himself the anchor plates would be repaired quietly. He had told himself it was a minor issue being handled through proper channels just without the formal paperwork. He had told himself a lot of things. And then the scaffold came down, he said. His voice had gone very quiet. And I knew, the moment I heard the sound and came around the corner and saw you on the floor, I knew those anchor plates hadn't been fixed. I knew she'd taken the money I should have refused and done nothing. Lily made a sound from the doorway that wasn't quite a word. Frank reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed an envelope on the kitchen table between us. The cashier's check was made out to cash, so there's no direct record of it, but I kept the deposit slip from when I put it into my account. And I kept this. He pushed the envelope toward me. The week after I took the money, she sent me a text message. Just 2 lines. Said the anchor plate maintenance had been scheduled for the following quarter and thanked me for my patience with the timeline. He swallowed. I think she sent it because she wanted something in writing that made it look like a legitimate administrative decision. She didn't know I'd screenshot it and print it and keep it. I looked at the envelope without touching it. "Frank," I said. "Why now?" He looked straight at me, and for the first time since he had walked through the door, his expression steadied. "Because I heard from somebody who knows somebody at her attorney's office that she's planning to put the whole thing on the contractor, the steel supplier. She's going to say she relied on vendor certifications and had no reason to question the materials." His jaw tightened. "And if that contractor's gone and nobody says different, it might work. And you'd be the one sitting in that courtroom with nobody to back up what actually happened." He pressed both palms flat on the table. "I'm not letting that happen," he said. "I should have talked 6 weeks ago. I know that. I'm not asking you to think well of me for waiting this long, but I'm asking if there's still time to do the right thing." I looked at this man who had made a bad decision under pressure and had spent 6 weeks being consumed by it, and I thought about all the ways a person can be tested and come up short and spend the rest of their life trying to find the moment where they can make it mean something different. "Call Marcus Webb," I said to Lily. "Tell him Frank Delgado needs to come in today." Sandra Mercer's office on South Stratford Road did not look like a place where people's lives got taken apart and reassembled into evidence. It looked like a place where someone kept very careful records. Every surface was clean. Every file was labeled. The bookshelves held accounting reference volumes arranged by publication year, and the single plant on the windowsill was the kind that required almost no attention and rewarded that neglect by staying alive indefinitely. It was the office of a woman who had decided long ago that precision was more useful than warmth and had never found reason to revise that opinion. Sandra Mercer had been a forensic accountant for 23 years. Webb had used her as an expert witness in 4 previous cases and described her testimony as the kind that made opposing attorneys visibly recalculate their strategy during recesses. She was in her mid-50s with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. And when Lily laid out the documents on the conference table, the photographs from the office, the materials logged the vendor purchase orders, the solvency reports Webb had obtained through the court's formal discovery process, Sandra put her glasses on and looked at everything for a long time before she touched a single page. "How long did your mother manage the company accounts?" she asked Lily. "About 18 years, Lily said. "Since the mid-90s. Sandra nodded slowly the way someone nods when a number confirms something they already suspected. She pulled the purchase order ledger toward her first and began moving through it page by page, occasionally stopping to make a small pencil mark in the margin. She did not explain the marks. She did not narrate what she was looking at. She simply worked with the focused quiet of someone who knew that the story was in the numbers and that the numbers would tell it in their own time. Lily called me from the conference table, putting the phone on speaker and setting it beside the document so I could listen from the spare bedroom on Clover Street. I sat with my legs stretched out and a legal pad on my knee, making notes in handwriting that had gotten progressively worse since the accident, because holding a pen for long periods still made my right hand cramp in ways I hadn't mentioned to the physical therapist. Sandra worked for 40 minutes without saying anything that wasn't a clarifying question. Then she set down her pencil and looked up at Lily across the table. "All right," she said, "here is what the records show." She had identified a pattern of irregular disbursements beginning approximately 20 months before the accident. Not large amounts at first, nothing that would trigger an automatic audit flag on a company with Callaway Ironworks revenue profile. The initial transfers ranged from $800 to $2,200, coded in the ledger as routine vendor payments under a category labeled Miscellaneous Materials Procurement. The vendor identification numbers attached to those line items did not match any supplier in the company's established vendor database. And that category is a standard budget line in most small manufacturing operations. Sandra explained, her voice carrying the flat precision of someone reading a weather report. It exists to handle incidental purchases that don't fit neatly into primary vendor relationships. Because the amounts are small and the category is vague by design, it tends to receive less scrutiny during internal review. Whoever set this up understood that. Over the following 14 months, the disbursement amounts increased gradually. By the final 6 months before the accident, individual transfers were reaching between $12,000 and $18,000 per transaction. The vendor identification numbers had shifted to a single entity, a company called MCC Holdings, registered in Delaware with a Winston-Salem mailing address that turned out to be a commercial mail forwarding service on Silas Creek Parkway. Webb had obtained the Delaware corporate registration records through the discovery process. MCC Holdings had been incorporated 26 months before the accident. Its registered agent was a formation service. Its sole officer was listed as Brandon T. Calloway. The total transferred from Calloway Iron Works operating accounts into MCC Holdings over the 20-month period. Sandra said, setting down a printed summary sheet in the center of the table, is $382,000, rounded to the nearest dollar. Lily made a sound like the air had gone out of her. Sandra looked at the summary sheet the way a surgeon looks at an X-ray, not emotionally, but with the complete attention of someone whose job is to see what is actually there, rather than what someone hoped was there. The authorization signature on every disbursement over $5,000 is Evelyn Calloway's. The smaller amounts were processed through an automated payment system that she set up and administered. She paused. There is no corresponding documentation of goods received, services rendered, or any legitimate business purpose for any of these transfers. That's embezzlement, Lily said. What I can tell you, Sandra said carefully, is that the financial record shows a systematic transfer of company funds to an entity controlled by a family member over an extended period without documented business justification, authorized by the individual who controlled the accounts. She removed her glasses. What you call it depends on what a prosecuting attorney decides to charge. What I can tell the court is what the numbers show. And the numbers show this was not accidental, not incidental, and not recent. She picked up her pen and wrote something at the bottom of the summary sheet. She turned it around and slid it across the table to Lily. It was a phone number. That is the direct line for the Financial Crimes Unit of the Forsyth County District Attorney's Office, Sandra said. Marcus Webb already has my report, but someone should make that call today. I heard Lily pick up the phone from the table, not the one I was on her own phone. Lily, I said. Yeah, Dad. Before you make that call, I said I need you to know something. She waited. Whatever comes next, I said, you have already done more than I had any right to ask of you. There was a pause on the line. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with something she was clearly working to keep steady. Dad, you taught me that you don't walk away from something just because it got hard. A breath. So, don't thank me yet. We're not done. She dialed the number. The call came on a Wednesday evening, 9 days after Lily dialed the number Sandra Mercer had written at the bottom of that summary sheet. Lily was in the kitchen making soup when her phone lit up on the counter. She looked at the screen, and her hand stopped moving over the cutting board. She picked it up and brought it to the doorway of the spare bedroom, where I was doing my evening leg exercises, 40 repetitions of controlled ankle flexion that Gail had prescribed, and that I had come to think of as the most boring 40 minutes of any given day. It's Mom, Lily said. Her voice had gone very flat. I stopped the exercise and looked at her. Put it on speaker. She answered on the fourth ring and set the phone on the dresser between us. The kitchen light behind her made it hard to read her face clearly, but I could see the way she had straightened her spine and set her jaw the way she did when she was preparing for something she had already decided she wasn't going to back down from. Lily. Evelyn's voice came through the speaker with the particular warmth of someone who has put considerable effort into sounding natural. I was hoping we could talk, just the two of us. Dad's here, Lily said. A brief pause. That's fine. I don't have anything to hide from your father. The warmth adjusted slightly, becoming something more careful. I wanted to reach out because I think this situation has gotten more complicated than any of us intended, and I believe there's still a way to resolve it that works for everyone involved. Go ahead, I said. Lily, you're a young woman with her whole life in front of her. You've been very loyal to your father, and I understand that. But what's happening now, the investigators, the attorneys, all of this, it's going to drag on for months, possibly longer. It's going to cost money none of us have budgeted for. It's going to be stressful and public and ugly. She paused. I'm prepared to offer you 15% of the total marital asset valuation. That's a significant amount of money. In exchange, I'd ask you to step back from your involvement in the proceedings. Let the attorneys handle it the way these things are meant to be handled. The room was quiet for a moment, except for the sound of a car passing on Clover Street outside. Lily looked at me. I gave her nothing, no nod, no shake of the head. This was her answer to give. She looked back at the phone. When she spoke, her voice was steady in the way that steel is steady, not because nothing is pressing against it, but because it was made to hold under pressure. Mom, I'm going to say this one time. I'm not stepping back. I'm not taking your money. And I want you to understand that this phone call, you calling me directly without your attorney present while legal proceedings are active, is something that Marcus Webb is going to hear about tomorrow morning. The warmth in Evelyn's voice disappeared completely. What replaced it was something I recognized from 35 years of marriage, the cold, exact tone she used when she had decided that a conversation was no longer worth the pretense of civility. "You're making a serious mistake, Lily," she said. "You're a young woman and you don't fully understand what you're involving yourself in. There are consequences to the choices you're making right now that you won't be able to walk back." "Is that a threat?" Lily asked. The line went dead. Lily stood very still for a moment, looking at the phone on the dresser. Then she picked it up, typed a text message to Webb, 8 words she called me directly. Recording the details now, and set it back down. "You okay?" I asked. She looked at me and her eyes were bright and furious and completely certain. "I'm better than okay," she said. "She's scared, Dad. That's what that was. I didn't sleep well that night. Not because of the legs, though they ached in the particular way they did when the weather was changing, but because I kept turning over the tone of Evelyn's voice in that last sentence before she hung up. There are consequences to the choices you're making right now. I had heard her speak thousands of sentences over 35 years. I knew the difference between frustration and warning. That had been a warning. The next morning, Lily came to my bedroom doorway at 7:45, with her coat already on, and her face carrying an expression I had not seen on her since she was a little girl, and had come to tell me that something she loved had been broken. "My car," she said. I reached for my crutches. We stood together in the parking lot, behind her building, in the thin, late February light, looking at what had been done. The driver's side window had been knocked inward, not cracked, not spiderwebbed, but punched completely through safety glass, scattered across the front seat in small, pale cubes that caught the morning light, like something that had no business being beautiful. The passenger side mirror had been wrenched off and was lying in the space beside the rear tire. Someone had taken something heavy and deliberate to the hood as well, leaving 2 parallel dents running from the windshield to the front edge. There were no cameras covering that section of the parking lot. The building manager confirmed it when Lily asked, his voice carrying the apologetic discomfort of someone who knows that information is not going to be useful to the person receiving it. Lily called the Winston-Salem Police Department and filed a criminal mischief report. The responding officer, a young man named Garrett, who had the methodical manner of someone new enough to the job to still take careful notes on everything, documented the damage and took photographs, and said that without witness accounts or surveillance footage the investigation would be limited, but that the report itself would be on record. That last part was what mattered. The report was on record. Lily photographed everything herself before the officer arrived and sent the full set to Webb while we were still standing in the parking lot. Webb called back within 10 minutes. The direct phone call last night combined with this, he said, gives us a pattern of conduct that a judge is going to find very interesting. His voice had the controlled energy of a man assembling something that is starting to fit together the way it was designed to. Evelyn's attorney doesn't know she made that call. I'd be willing to bet money on that. She went around him, which means she panicked, which means she knows what's coming. He paused. "Marcus," I said. "How long until the trial date?" 3 weeks, he said. "And Robert, this morning, Simmons called me. She has the call records from the prepaid number. She knows which number it called last." Another pause, shorter this time. "She's ready to go to the DA. Before I reveal the shocking truth my daughter uncovered the dark night, please comment 'still here' below so I know you're still watching and standing with us. Also, please note the following events include some fictionalized elements enhanced for educational and dramatic purposes. If this content isn't right for you, feel free to turn off the video right here. The Forsyth County Courthouse on North Church Street had been standing since 1976, a square brick building with the particular institutional gravity of a place where things get decided. I had driven past it hundreds of times over 40 years without ever needing to go inside. That morning, Lily pushed my wheelchair through the front entrance at 8:47:13 minutes before the hearing was scheduled to begin, and the cold March air came in with us through the doors and did not entirely leave. The elevator to the third floor smelled like old carpet and copy paper. Neither of us spoke on the way up. There was nothing left to say that we hadn't already said, and both of us understood that what mattered now was not words between us, but the words that would be spoken in the room at the end of the hallway. Webb was waiting outside courtroom 3 with his briefcase open on a bench and a legal pad covered in his small, precise handwriting, balanced on his knee. He looked up when he heard the wheelchair and gave us a single nod, not reassuring, not performative, just the acknowledgement of a man who had done his preparation and was ready to work. "Greer filed a supplemental motion this morning," he said, quietly falling into step beside us. "He's requesting that the court appoint an independent guardian ad litem to represent what he's calling Robert's diminished decision-making capacity. I've already filed an objection. Judge Holt will rule on it before the main hearing begins." I felt Lily's hands tighten on the wheelchair handles behind me. "What does that mean practically?" she asked. "It means they're trying to establish before we even get into the room that Robert cannot legally direct his own defense." Webb's voice stayed level. "It won't succeed, but it tells us they're worried about what we have." Inside courtroom 3. The morning light came through high windows along the east wall, falling in long, pale strips across the wooden gallery benches. The room was smaller than I had imagined, and more worn, the kind of worn that comes from decades of ordinary human difficulty being processed through the same chairs, the same tables, the same wood-paneled walls. At the far end, the judge's bench sat elevated above everything else, empty and waiting. Evelyn was already seated at the plaintiff's table, with Thomas Greer beside her. She was wearing a charcoal suit I had never seen before, her hair arranged with careful precision, pearl earrings at her ears. She looked composed and credible, and not at all like a woman who had called her daughter directly 9 days before a court hearing to offer a bribe. Brandon sat in the front row of the gallery directly behind her, in a jacket that had cost more than my first truck. I did not look at either of them for long. In the third row of the gallery, Pastor Glenn Whitaker sat with his hands folded on his knees, and his good suit on the dark blue one Eleanor pressed for him every Sunday morning. He caught my eye when Lily wheeled me to the defendant's table and gave me a small, firm nod, the kind that does not promise outcomes but acknowledges that you are not alone in the room. Judge Patricia Holt entered at precisely 9 o'clock. She was in her late 50s trim and deliberate in her movements with close-cropped silver hair, and the particular bearing of someone who has spent 20 years in a room where every person present is trying to convince her of something. She greeted both counsel tables with equal brevity, settled into her chair, and opened the case file without ceremony. She ruled on Greer's guardian ad litem motion in 4 minutes, denied with a written note that the motion lacked evidentiary foundation and that the court saw no basis to question the defendant's legal capacity at this stage of proceedings. Greer accepted the ruling with a small inclination of his head that suggested he had not truly expected to win it. Then the main hearing began. Greer went first. He was good, genuinely good, the kind of attorney who understands that a jury, or in this case a judge, responds not just to facts, but to narrative, and who has spent enough years in courtrooms to know how to build one. He spoke for 55 minutes. He described Robert Calloway as a man who had built a business through hard work and determination, and who had, through no fault of his own, suffered injuries that had permanently altered his physical capacity and placed significant ongoing burdens on those around him. He used the word disabled 4 times. He used the phrase quality of life 7 times. He argued that Evelyn Calloway had contributed equally to the marriage's financial foundation and was entitled under North Carolina equitable distribution law to a fair and proportionate share of the marital estate. He was careful, and he was measured, and every word he said was designed to sound reasonable. Then he submitted the psychiatric evaluation. The report was 42 pages bound in a blue cover, authored by a Dr. Wallace Hinton, and concluding that Robert Calloway exhibited measurable cognitive decline consistent with traumatic brain injury sustained in the workplace accident, and that this decline materially affected his capacity for sound, financial, and legal decision-making. Greer submitted 3 copies, 1 for the court, 1 for Webb, 1 for the record. Webb received his copy, opened it to the title page, and read the author's name without any visible reaction. He wrote something on his legal pad and underlined it twice. I watched Judge Holt read the executive summary on the first 2 pages. She turned to the author credentials section on page 3. She read for a moment, then she looked up and said something quietly to her clerk, who was seated to her left. The clerk leaned in, listened, nodded, and rose from his chair. He walked to the side door of the courtroom and disappeared through it. Greer was explaining the methodology of the psychiatric evaluation to no one in particular, filling the room with words while the clerk was gone. Evelyn sat with her hands folded and her expression pleasant and untroubled. Brandon had stopped looking at his phone. The clerk returned 3 minutes later carrying a printed document. He set it in front of Judge Holt. She read it. Her expression did not change, but she removed her glasses and set them down on the bench in a way that felt deliberate. She looked toward the defense table. "Mr. Webb," she said, "before you begin your opening statement, I have a question regarding the psychiatric evaluation just submitted by the plaintiff." Webb stood. "Of course, Your Honor." She looked at the printed document again. Then she looked at Greer. Thomas Greer had gone the particular color of a man who has just understood that something has gone wrong but does not yet know how wrong. "I'll address this after the morning recess," Judge Holt said. "We'll take 15 minutes. She brought her gavel down once cleanly and rose from the bench. The 15-minute recess lasted 22 minutes. I spent most of it in the hallway outside courtroom 3, my wheelchair parked beside a water fountain that dripped with the slow persistence of something that had been meaning to get fixed for a long time. Webb stood close and spoke quietly, his voice carrying the careful control of a man who had just confirmed something he had suspected since the moment he read the author's name on the cover of that blue-bound report. "Wallace Hinton," he said. "His license to practice psychiatry in the state of North Carolina was revoked by the medical board 8 months ago. Conduct unbecoming falsification of clinical records in a separate proceeding. The clerk pulled his board status in about 4 minutes. He paused. Evelyn retained him after the revocation. Either she didn't know which is possible, but unlikely given that she was thorough about everything else, or she knew and believed no one would check. She believed no one would check, I said. Webb looked at me for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I think so too." Lily was standing with her back against the hallway wall, arms crossed, jaw set, working through something in her mind that she wasn't ready to say out loud yet. When the clerk opened the courtroom door and indicated we could return, she pushed my wheelchair through without a word, and I could feel in the steadiness of her hands that she had finished whatever internal calculation she had been running and had arrived at a conclusion that satisfied her. Back inside the room felt different. The morning light through the east windows had shifted angle falling now across the plaintiff's table rather than the gallery benches. Thomas Greer sat with the blue-bound report in front of him, open to the credentials page, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man trying very hard to look as though he is not recalculating everything. Evelyn had turned slightly in her chair. For the first time since the hearing began, she was looking at me directly, not with contempt, not with guilt. With the careful measuring look of a woman reassessing a situation she believed she had fully controlled. I held her gaze until she turned away. Judge Holt returned to the bench and settled her papers with unhurried precision. A revoked license means Dr. Hinton had no legal authority to conduct psychiatric evaluations or author clinical reports for any purpose, including court proceedings, at the time this evaluation was performed. She set the report to one side of her desk, with a deliberateness that made the gesture feel final. "The psychiatric evaluation submitted by the plaintiff is inadmissible. It will not be considered by this court." Greer stood. "Your Honor, the plaintiff was not aware." "Mr. Greer." Judge Holt's voice did not rise, but it acquired a quality that stopped him mid-sentence the way a closed door stops forward motion. "I am not suggesting bad faith on your part. I am stating a legal fact. The document is inadmissible. You may submit a request for continuance if you wish to obtain a valid evaluation, but I will tell you now that given the timeline of this case and the circumstances of the submission, I would not look favorably on such a request." She looked at him over the top of her glasses. "Do you wish to request a continuance?" Greer looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at the table. "No, Your Honor," Greer said. He sat down and removed his glasses and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose, and in that small gesture, that quiet private concession to the pressure of a moment going wrong, I saw the shape of what was happening to their case. It was not collapsing dramatically. It was deflating the way Webb had once described it to me, like air leaving something that was never as solid as it appeared. Webb rose from the defense table with the unhurried confidence of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Your Honor, the defense would like to call Dr. Patricia Osei. Dr. Osei came from the gallery where she had been seated in the second row since the hearing began, dressed in a charcoal blazer with a small gold pin at the lapel, carrying a manila folder with the compact efficiency of someone accustomed to moving through professional spaces without needing to announce herself. She was in her early 50s with a composed, direct manner that made the witness stand feel like a natural extension of her usual environment rather than something unfamiliar. She had been board certified in neurology for 21 years. She had performed cognitive and neurological assessments for legal proceedings on 37 prior occasions. She had examined Robert Calloway 6 weeks before the hearing, administering a full battery of neuropsychological testing that included assessments of executive function, working memory, processing speed, and decision-making capacity under conditions of moderate stress. Her findings delivered in the precise, unhurried language of someone who understood that clarity was more persuasive than emphasis were unambiguous. Robert Calloway's cognitive function was entirely within normal parameters for his age group. His executive function scores placed him in the 78th percentile for men between 60 and 70. His decision-making capacity was not impaired. His ability to direct his own legal affairs was not in question. Greer had 3 questions on cross-examination. Dr. Osei answered each one with the patience of a woman who has spent 2 decades explaining complex medical realities to people who were hoping for a different answer. By the 3rd question, Greer stopped asking. He closed his notepad and set it down. He did not look at Evelyn when he did it. That was the thing I noticed most. In the 3 hours since the hearing had begun, Thomas Greer had glanced at his client at least a dozen times, small confirmations the natural communication of an attorney and the person he represents. After Dr. Osei stepped down from the witness stand, he did not look at Evelyn once. Evelyn noticed. I watched her notice. The slight tightening around her eyes, the infinitesimal adjustment of her posture, the moment when a person understands that the person standing beside them has begun to calculate an exit. She turned and looked at Brandon in the front row of the gallery. Brandon was looking at his hands. Webb returned to the defense table and leaned toward me. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the controlled energy of a man watching something come together the way it was designed to. Your Honor, he said, rising again, the defense would like to call Detective Carol Simmons to the stand. The lunch recess lasted 40 minutes. I ate nothing. Lily brought a sandwich from the vending machine in the basement corridor and set it on the table beside me, and neither of us mentioned it again. Webb used the time to review his notes in a methodical silence that I had come to understand was not absence of thought, but the opposite of it. Outside the tall windows, the March sky had gone the flat white of a day that had decided not to commit to either sun or cloud. When Judge Holt returned and the afternoon session began, Detective Carol Simmons walked to the witness stand with the unhurried, purposeful stride of a woman who had testified in courtrooms enough times to have stopped finding them intimidating and had started finding them simply functional. She was in her mid-40s, wearing a dark blazer over a white shirt, her badge clipped to her belt, rather than displayed, which struck me as the choice of someone who understood that authority in a courtroom comes from what you know rather than what you wear. She stated her credentials without elaboration. 14 years with the Forsyth County Sheriff's Office, 8 years in the Criminal Investigations Division, 41 cases involving workplace injury and structural failure. She had worked alongside licensed forensic engineers on 19 of those cases. Webb walked her through the physical evidence first. She described the east wall scaffolding examination with Dr. Raymond Hess in precise technical language that left no interpretive room. 3 of the 4 load-bearing anchor bolts had been deliberately backed off by hand. Thread engagement reduced to between 20 and 30% of required specification. The failure pattern was inconsistent with material fatigue corrosion or installation error. Dr. Hess had committed his findings to a signed written report, which Webb submitted to the court as Exhibit 14. Then Webb moved to the access records. Simmons explained how the building management system at Callaway Ironworks logged every card swipe entry and exit at secured areas with a date and timestamp. She had obtained the records through a properly issued subpoena to the building management company. The structural hardware storage room, the room containing the tools and equipment necessary to adjust the scaffold anchor bolts, had been accessed by 3 individuals in the 72 hours before the accident. She named them in order. Robert Calloway, Monday afternoon at 2:53, consistent with his regular weekly floor inspection. Frank Delgado, Tuesday morning at 7:43, consistent with the start of his shift. Brandon Calloway, Tuesday evening at 9:17 after the close of business, after the crew had gone home, in a building that should have had no reason to bring the owner's son to a structural hardware storage room on a Tuesday night. Greer stood for cross-examination. He asked whether other individuals had access to the building generally. Simmons confirmed they did. He asked whether the access log proved what Brandon had done inside the storage room. Simmons said it proved he had been there. He asked whether it was possible Brandon had a routine reason for the visit. Simmons looked at him with the patient expression of someone being asked a question they have already considered thoroughly. In 14 years of investigations, she said, I have found that people rarely visit structural hardware storage rooms at 9:17 on a Tuesday evening for routine reasons, particularly when those same storage rooms contain the tools necessary to adjust the components that failed the following morning. Greer had no follow-up. Webb stood again. Detective Simmons, did your investigation extend to the contractor who supplied the structural steel used in the East Wall project? It did. And what did you find regarding Tri-State Fabrication Solutions? She walked through it methodically. Business license registered with the North Carolina Secretary of State 8 days before Evelyn Calloway signed the purchase order. Sole point of contact listed as a prepaid cell number. The company dissolved 14 days after the accident. The prepaid number had made 6 outgoing calls during the entire period the company existed. The final call, placed at 8:41 on the morning the contractor's equipment was last seen at the Calloway Ironworks address, had gone to a cell phone registered to Brandon Thomas Calloway. The courtroom became very quiet, not gradually. All at once, the way a room goes quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Brandon stood up. It was not a controlled movement. His chair scraped back hard against the gallery floor, and he was on his feet before anyone had finished processing that he was moving. His face had gone the deep blotchy red of a man whose body has decided to react before his mind has caught up with the consequences. That's not, he started. Greer was on his feet in the same instant, one hand extended toward his client, with the firm practiced authority of a man who has spent decades preventing people from making their situations worse by speaking when they should not. Sit down, Greer said sharp and low. Brandon sat, but the damage was done in the 3 words he had not finished saying, and the way his body had moved before his judgment could stop it. Judge Holt had seen it. I watched her make a small notation on the pad beside her, her pen moving with the calm precision of someone recording a fact rather than an opinion. The courtroom stayed quiet. Webb let the quiet sit for a full 10 seconds before he spoke. When he did, his voice was level and deliberate, the voice of a man who understood that the room had just shifted in a way that did not require emphasis. Your Honor, he said, the defense would like to call Mr. Frank Delgado to the stand. Evelyn turned her head toward the courtroom entrance. For the first time all day, she looked genuinely uncertain. Not frightened, not yet, but uncertain in the way a person looks when they have been tracking every variable in a situation and have just realized there is one they did not account for. Frank Delgado was already walking through the door. Frank Delgado walked to the witness stand the way a man walks when he has made a decision that cost him something to arrive at and has no intention of turning back from it now. Not quickly. Not with the performed confidence of someone who has rehearsed this moment until it felt comfortable. Just steadily, one foot in front of the other, the way a person moves when they have accepted what they are about to do and are simply doing it. He did not look at Evelyn when he passed the plaintiff's table. He looked at me. It lasted only a second, his eyes finding mine, as he moved past a brief direct acknowledgement that carried more weight than most conversations I had sat through in 30 years of running a business. Then he looked forward again and took his seat on the witness stand and folded his hands on the rail in front of him. Webb established his credentials simply. 31 years in industrial fabrication and materials management. 22 of those years as floor supervisor and then general manager at Calloway Ironworks. Hired by Robert Calloway in the 2nd year of the business. No criminal record, no prior civil litigation. Then Webb asked him to describe the events of the quarterly safety inspection 3 months before the accident. Frank told it the same way he had told it at Lily's kitchen table, without embellishment, without self-justification, with the flat factual cadence of a man who has decided that the only thing he has left to offer is accuracy. He described finding the stress cracks in the anchor plates. He described bringing the report to Evelyn. He described the meeting in her office, the closed door, the envelope slid across the desk, the $3,500 in a cashier's check made out to cash, and the words she had used when she explained what the money was for. The courtroom was very still. When Frank finished, Greer stood with the particular controlled energy of an attorney who has identified the angle he intends to use and is confident in it. "Mr. Delgado," he said, "is it true that you resigned from Callaway Ironworks 3 weeks after the accident?" "I did," Frank said. "And is it true that prior to your resignation there had been discussions between you and the company's management regarding your performance?" Frank looked at him steadily. "There were no such discussions." "Are you certain?" "I'm certain. I resigned because I could not walk into that building every morning and look at the place where Robert Callaway hit the floor." His voice did not waver. "That was the only reason." Greer shifted direction. "Mr. Delgado, you've testified that my client paid you $3,500. You've described this as an improper payment. But isn't it true that Callaway Ironworks routinely made discretionary payments to long-term employees for consulting and advisory services?" "Not in my experience," Frank said. "You're asking this court to believe that after 22 years of employment, you accepted a bribe from a woman whose family you had worked alongside for 2 decades and then stayed silent about it for months. Doesn't that strain credibility?" Frank looked at him for a long moment, not with anger, with the expression of a man who has already asked himself that question more times than he can count, and has stopped expecting the answer to make him feel better. "Yes," he said, "it does." Greer paused. That was not the answer he had expected. "And yet you're asking this court to take your word for it," Greer continued, recovering. "No," Frank said, "I'm not asking you to take my word for anything." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a plain white envelope. He held it out toward Webb, who took it and carried it to the judge's clerk, who carried it to Judge Holt. She opened it without ceremony and looked at the contents. 2 items, both photocopied a bank deposit slip and a printed screenshot of a text message. Webb addressed the court. The deposit slip showed a cash deposit of $3,500 into Frank Delgado's personal checking account on the same date Evelyn's office calendar obtained through discovery showed a private meeting between the two of them. The text message sent from a number registered to Evelyn Callaway's personal cell account read as follows: "Anchor plate maintenance has been scheduled for Q3. Thank you for your patience with the timeline." The message was dated 2 days after the meeting, 2 days after the envelope crossed the desk. Evelyn's attorney had no copy of this text message in his files. Webb had confirmed that with Greer's paralegal 3 days before the hearing. Greer stood very still at the plaintiff's table. He was no longer looking at his notes. He was looking at the copies the clerk had placed in front of him, turning through them slowly, and with each page his expression became slightly more controlled, in the way expressions become controlled when the person behind them is working very hard not to let anything show. He removed his glasses. He pressed them against the bridge of his nose and held them there for a moment with 2 fingers' eyes closed, and I watched something go out of him, not dramatically, not with any visible collapse, but in the quiet, private way that certainty leaves a person, when the ground beneath their argument shifts and does not shift back. He set his glasses on the table. "No further questions," he said. Evelyn turned and looked at me for the first time since the morning session, not with contempt, not with calculation, with something I had not seen on her face in years and could not entirely name, something that might have been in another life a version of regret. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then she turned away. Judge Holt reviewed the documents in the envelope with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who understood that what she was looking at would inform everything that followed. When she finished, she set them down and looked at the clock on the wall above the gallery entrance. "It is 4:47, she said. "This court will recess until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, at which time I will open and review the sealed independent investigation report submitted to this court by the Forsyth County District Attorney's Office." She looked at both counsel tables with equal deliberateness. "I would advise all parties to be prepared for a full session tomorrow. We will not be recessing early." She brought her gavel down once. I sat in my wheelchair at the defense table while the room began to gather itself, papers shuffling chairs, moving the low murmur of people resuming ordinary motion after a long period of stillness. Lily crouched beside me and put her hand on my arm without saying anything. Webb began organizing his files with the methodical efficiency of a man who still had work to do before the morning. Outside the high windows, the March sky had gone dark. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed, and the sound of it echoed down the corridor and faded into the kind of quiet that only courthouses have at the end of a long day, not peaceful exactly, but finished the way a sentence is finished when the last word has been placed, and everything after is simply waiting for what comes next. Tomorrow, the sealed envelope would be opened. I had waited 3.5 months for tomorrow. I did not sleep well. The spare bedroom on Clover Street had become familiar to me. Over the past 3 months, the particular way the streetlight came through the curtain gap, the sound of the heating system cycling on at 2 in the morning, the small adjustments Lily had made to the room, so that I could navigate it without assistance. I knew that room the way you come, to know any space where you have spent long nights thinking about things you cannot yet resolve. That night I lay awake and thought about nothing complicated. I thought about the sign above the workshop door. I thought about my father sitting at the kitchen table looking at his hands. I thought about a 9-year-old boy spelling hero wrong on a folded piece of paper. Small things. The kind of things a person returns to when the large things have been handed over to other people, and there is nothing left to do but wait for morning. At 6:30, I heard Lily moving in the kitchen. I heard the coffee maker. I heard her set a mug on the counter with the particular care of someone trying not to wake a person they believe is sleeping. I put on my braces in the dark and went to join her. She looked at me when I came through the doorway and said nothing for a moment. Then she poured a second mug and set it across the table from her own, and we sat together in the kitchen while the sun came up outside the window on Clover Street, and neither of us needed to say anything about what the day was going to bring. We arrived at the courthouse at 8:38. Webb was already there standing outside courtroom 3 with no briefcase open, no legal pad in hand, just Webb himself in his good suit jacket buttoned the particular stillness of a man who has finished all the preparation he is going to do and has arrived at the part where the work belongs to someone else. He looked at us when we came off the elevator. "How are you feeling?" Lily asked him. "Ready?" he said. That was all. Inside the courtroom, the morning light fell differently than the day before, coming from a lower angle through the east windows, casting longer shadows across the gallery benches and the counsel tables. Evelyn was already seated. She was wearing the same charcoal suit as yesterday, which told me she had not gone home last night either, or had not thought about changing, which amounted to the same thing. Greer sat beside her with his briefcase open, but his hands still not reviewing notes, simply present. Brandon was in the front row of the gallery again, but he was sitting differently forward, elbows on knees, the posture of a man who has spent the night running calculations and has not liked any of the answers. Pastor Glenn was in the third row, same dark blue suit, same folded hands. Judge Patricia Holt entered at exactly 9 o'clock, and the room rose and settled with the practiced efficiency of people who had been through this enough times to know the rhythm. She arranged her papers. She looked at both counsel tables with equal, unhurried attention. Then she reached beneath the bench and placed a sealed manila envelope on the surface in front of her. The envelope was not large. It was the size of a standard legal document sealed with red evidence tape across the flap, stamped in blue ink along the lower left corner with the seal of the Forsyth County District Attorney's Office. It sat on the bench between the judge's hands like something that had been patient for a very long time and was finally in the right place. Judge Holt broke the seal without ceremony. She did not rush. She read the way she did everything with complete unhurried attention, as though the room and the people in it could wait as long as the document required. She turned the first page, the second. She paused at the third page for a long moment, her finger moving along a line of text, then moved to the fourth. No one in the courtroom made a sound. I watched Evelyn. She had her hands folded on the table in front of her, and her posture was composed, and her expression was the expression she had worn every morning of this hearing, careful, credible, the look of a woman who believes she is in a room that has not yet fully understood her position. She had worn that expression for 35 years, and she wore it now with the same practiced ease. Judge Holt stopped at page 7. She read one section twice. I watched her eyes move back to the top of the paragraph and track through it again with the slow deliberateness of someone confirming what they have just read before they decide what to do with it. Then she set the report down and looked up. Her eyes moved to Evelyn. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "this report includes documentation of a life insurance policy on the life of Robert Calloway amended 6 weeks prior to the workplace accident that is the subject of these proceedings. The amendment increased the policy value to $2,400,000 and added Brandon Calloway as a co-beneficiary alongside yourself." She paused. "The investigation concludes that this amendment taken together with the procurement fraud, the falsified materials, approval, and the access log evidence presented yesterday constitutes sufficient grounds to establish willful conduct with intent to cause harm for purposes of North Carolina's fault-based divorce statute." She looked at Evelyn steadily. "Under that statute, a spouse found to have engaged in willful conduct, causing physical harm to the other spouse, forfeits all rights to equitable distribution of marital assets." The room absorbed this. Evelyn absorbed it. For 3 full seconds, she sat perfectly still, and I watched the expression she had maintained for 2 days do something I had not seen it do in 35 years of marriage. It came apart, not gradually. All at once, the way something comes apart, when the single point holding it together gives way without warning. Her face went through 4 distinct expressions in the space of those 3 seconds: disbelief, calculation, fury, and something beneath the fury that might have been the first honest emotion she had allowed herself in this building. She stood up. Her chair went back hard, and she brought both palms flat down on the plaintiff's table with a crack that echoed off the wood-paneled walls and made Greer flinch and made Brandon grab the gallery rail in front of him. Her voice came out at a volume I had not heard from her in 35 years of marriage, raw and broken at the edges and stripped of every careful layer she had built around it. "That is not possible." Her eyes swept the room and landed on me and stayed there. "That is not possible. How did a cripple and that girl get their hands on those documents?" Detective Carol Simmons stepped through the side door of the courtroom. She was holding a document the arrest warrant signed the previous afternoon by the Forsyth County District Attorney following a formal review of the investigation report. She walked to the plaintiff's table with the measured pace of someone executing a process that had been carefully prepared and did not require haste. "Mrs. Calloway," Simmons said, "I have a warrant for your arrest." Greer stood, his mouth opened. Then he closed it again because there was nothing in 30 years of legal practice that had prepared him with the right words for this specific moment, and he was experienced enough to know it. Brandon stood up in the gallery. He looked at his mother. He looked at Simmons. He looked at me for the first time since the hearing had begun, not with defiance, not with calculation, with the raw, stripped look of a man whose entire scaffolding has just given way. The handcuffs closed around Evelyn's wrists with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. She did not look at me again as Simmons guided her toward the side door. She looked straight ahead, chin up the last performance of a woman who had been performing for so long she had forgotten there was another way to move through a room. The door closed behind them. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. The side door closed behind Evelyn and Carol Simmons, and the sound of it was so ordinary. Just a door, just a latch catching in a frame, that for a moment it seemed impossible that something so large had ended with something so small. The courtroom held very still. Then, one by one, the ordinary sounds of a room returning to itself began to filter back in. A chair shifted. Someone in the gallery cleared their throat. Greer began gathering papers from the plaintiff's table with the careful, deliberate movements of a man performing a task. Because performing a task is better than standing in the aftermath of what has just happened without anything to do with his hands. Brandon had not moved. He was still standing in the front row of the gallery, both hands gripping the wooden rail in front of him, his knuckles gone pale with the pressure of it. He was staring at the side door through which his mother had just been walked out of the room, and his face had the particular blankness of someone whose internal processing has exceeded what his expression knows how to display. Then he turned and looked at me. I was still at the defense table, my wheelchair facing forward, the morning light from the east windows falling across my hands in my lap. I had the letter out now, the folded piece of paper I had carried in my wallet for 23 years, the creases worn soft from being opened and refolded more times than I could count. The paper itself gone the color of old cream. I held it between my fingers without unfolding it. Brandon's eyes dropped to it. I watched him recognize it. Not immediately, it took 3 or 4 seconds, the delayed recognition of something seen so long ago that the memory of it lives in a different part of the mind than recent things. But then I saw it happen. His jaw shifted, his grip on the gallery rail tightened, and then released completely like a man who has just lost the thing he was holding on to. He came down from the gallery slowly, not walking toward me exactly, but moving in my direction the way a person moves when they are no longer capable of staying where they are and have not yet decided where they are going. He stopped at the low wooden barrier separating the gallery from the council area and stood there 4 feet away, looking at the letter in my hands. "Dad," he said. His voice came out broken in the middle of the single syllable, cracked and hollow, the voice of a man who has been awake all night, running away from the moment he is now standing inside. I did not answer him. Not out of cruelty. I want to be clear about that. I had thought in the long months since the accident about what I would say to my son if I ever had the chance to say it in a room where the truth had already been established and there was nothing left to perform for. I had rehearsed versions of it in the dark on the spare bedroom on Clover Street, the way you rehearse things you are afraid you will handle badly. Measured words, careful sentences, the kind of language that communicates disappointment without becoming its own wound. But standing there in that courtroom with the letter between my fingers, I understood that I did not have measured words for Brandon Calloway. I had something older and quieter than words. I placed the letter on the defense table. I did not slide it toward him. I did not hold it out. I simply set it down on the table in the space between us and took my hand away from it and waited. Brandon stared at it for a long moment. Then he leaned forward and picked it up with both hands the way you pick up something you are afraid of dropping, and unfolded it. The handwriting was a child's large, uneven letters pressing hard into the paper, the way children press when they are concentrating, each word slightly different in size from the one before it. The spelling was imperfect in 3 places. The sentiment was not. "Dear Dad, thank you for teaching me to ride my bike today. You never gave up on me even when I fell down. You are my hero. I love you, Brandon." He read it once. Then he read it again. His shoulders began to shake. It started as a small movement, barely perceptible, the kind of tremor that begins when a person has been holding something rigid for so long that the muscles responsible for the holding give out before the person has consciously decided to let go. Then it became something larger and less controlled, and Brandon Calloway, 32 years old, expensive jacket. A man who had spent 3 months calculating and maneuvering and standing beside his mother with the practiced ease of someone who believed he was winning, pressed both hands over his face and wept in a way that had nothing performed about it. It was the most honest thing I had seen him do since he was 9 years old. Lily was standing behind my wheelchair. I felt her hand come to rest on my shoulder, not squeezing, not pressing, just present the way she had been present since the 3rd morning in that hospital room when she had walked through the door and refused to leave. 2 officers from the sheriff's office appeared at the gallery entrance. They moved quietly without urgency toward Brandon. One of them spoke to him in a low voice, not unkindly, but with the clear, patient tone of someone delivering information that is not negotiable. Brandon would need to come with them. Not under arrest, not yet, but the district attorney's office needed to speak with him regarding his role in the events under investigation, and that conversation needed to happen today. Brandon lowered his hands from his face. His eyes were red and wet, and he was breathing in the unsteady rhythm of a person who has cried hard and recently. He looked at the letter still in his hands. He set it back on the defense table. Then he looked at me one more time, not with the calculating assessment of the man who had stood in my hospital room 3 months ago, telling me it was better this way, but with something rawer and less protected, something that I recognized from 32 years earlier from a driveway and a bicycle, and a boy who had fallen 7 times and gotten up every time because his father was watching. I held his gaze. The officers waited. Brandon straightened his jacket with one hand, a small automatic gesture, the muscle memory of a man trying to collect himself, and walked toward the gallery entrance between the 2 officers without being guided. At the door, he stopped. He did not turn around. "Dad," he said. His voice was steadier now, not much but enough. "I'm sorry. I had waited a long time to hear those words. Now that they had arrived, I found that I did not know what to do with them, except let them be what they were, insufficient and necessary and true." "I know," I said. The door opened. Brandon walked through it. The door closed. Lily's hand tightened on my shoulder. "Dad," she said softly, "it's over." I looked at the letter on the defense table. Then I looked at the side door through which Evelyn had gone. Then I looked at the high windows and the March sky beyond them, pale and wide, and indifferent to everything that had just happened in the room below it. "No," I said. "It's beginning." The recess lasted 31 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall above the gallery entrance for most of it, the round institutional clock with the black rim and the second hand that moved in small, precise jumps rather than a smooth sweep. The kind of clock that has been telling people how long they have been waiting since before most of them were born. Webb sat beside me and did not speak. Lily stood at the tall windows looking out at the March sky. In the gallery, Pastor Glenn remained in his third-row seat, hands folded the same posture he had held since the hearing began 2 days ago. He had not left once, not for lunch, not during the recesses, not when things in this room had become loud, and then very quiet, and then loud again. Sandra Mercer was in the 5th row. I had not noticed her arrive, but she was there, her close-cropped gray hair, her reading glasses on their chain, her hands folded on the small notebook she carried everywhere. She had come, I understood not because anyone had asked her to, but because 23 years of forensic accounting had taught her that the numbers she uncovered in offices and conference rooms had consequences in rooms like this one, and she had decided she wanted to see what those consequences looked like. Greer sat alone at the plaintiff's table. He had his briefcase open in front of him, and his jacket on and his tie straight, and he was doing what attorneys do when a situation has moved beyond their ability to influence it. He was managing the paperwork. Organizing, reorganizing, clipping documents together, the professional equivalent of keeping your hands busy so that no one, including yourself, can see that they have nothing left to hold. Judge Patricia Holt returned to the bench at 10:47. The room rose and settled. She arranged her papers with her usual unhurried precision and looked at both counsel tables. Webb at the defense, Greer alone at the plaintiff's, with the equal steady attention of someone who has made her decision and is about to deliver it without theater. Yet this court has now reviewed the complete evidentiary record in the matter of Callaway versus Callaway. She began, including the testimony presented over the course of these 2 days, the physical and documentary evidence admitted into the record, and the independent investigation report submitted by the Forsyth County District Attorney's Office. She paused. I will address each element of the petition in turn. She looked at the file open in front of her, then back at the room. With respect to the petition for equitable distribution of marital assets, this court finds that the evidence establishes by clear and convincing standard that Evelyn Callaway engaged in willful conduct, causing direct physical harm to Robert Callaway through the deliberate falsification of materials, procurement records, the suppression of a mandatory safety inspection report, and the procurement of substandard structural materials used in equipment that failed and caused serious injury. She turned a page. Under North Carolina General Statutes, Section 50-16, a spouse found to have engaged in such conduct forfeits all rights to equitable distribution of marital assets. Accordingly, this court finds that Evelyn Callaway is entitled to no portion of the marital estate. The room absorbed this in the way rooms absorb things that are large and have been expected, and are nonetheless significant when they finally arrive. Greer wrote something on his legal pad. His pen moved slowly. Judge Holt continued. This court further finds that the marital home located at 417 Ridgefield Lane, Winston-Salem, and the business known as Callaway Iron Works, located at Industrial Drive, Winston-Salem, including all associated real property equipment accounts and intellectual property, are awarded in full to Robert James Callaway. She looked up from the file and looked directly at me. Mr. Callaway, what was built by your hands over 40 years, remains yours. I had prepared myself for this moment. I had thought about it in the hospital, in the therapy sessions, in the spare bedroom on Clover Street, in the courthouse hallway during recesses. I had told myself I would receive the words calmly, the way a man receives confirmation of something he has worked toward, rather than something that has been given to him. What I had not prepared for was how much it would feel like both. My throat tightened around something I could not name and did not try to. Webb put his hand briefly on my forearm, once firm, and then gone the way a man who understands restraint offers acknowledgement. Judge Holt was not finished. This court also notes for the record that the conduct documented in these proceedings extends beyond the civil matter before this court into potential criminal liability. This court has certified the evidentiary record to the Forsyth County District Attorney's Office for review and appropriate action. The court takes no position on the outcome of any subsequent criminal proceedings, as those matters will be addressed in the appropriate venue. She closed the file. She looked at Greer. Mr. Greer, your client's conduct in this matter, including the direct contact made with a material witness outside the presence of counsel and the submission of an evaluation authored by a practitioner whose license had been revoked, will be noted in the court's final written order. I would encourage you to review your ethical obligations regarding the circumstances of that submission. Greer nodded once. It was a small movement, and it cost him something. Judge Holt brought her gavel down once cleanly and without emphasis. This matter is concluded. For a moment, no one moved. Then slowly the room began to exhale. Papers moved. Chairs shifted. Webb began organizing the defense file with the methodical efficiency of a man who had done what he came to do and was ready to move to whatever came next. In the gallery, Sandra Mercer opened her notebook and wrote something brief, then closed it again. Pastor Glenn unfolded his hands, placed both palms on his knees, and looked at me across the room with an expression that had in it everything 30 years of Sunday mornings and casseroles and knowing each other's families could put into a single look. He did not smile. He simply nodded. I nodded back. Lily crouched beside my wheelchair, her face level with mine, her eyes bright and red-rimmed and certain. She did not say anything for a moment. She simply looked at me the way she had looked at me in the hospital doorway 4 months ago, taking inventory, making sure I was still there. "You okay?" she asked. I thought about the question honestly. "I will be," I said. She stood and moved behind the wheelchair. Her hands closed around the handles. I looked at the defense table in front of me, the letter still sitting where Brandon had set it back down, the pale cream paper catching the morning light. I reached forward and picked it up. I folded it carefully along its original creases and put it back in my wallet in the same place it had lived for 23 years. It belonged there. It had always belonged there. Nothing that had happened in this room over the past 2 days changed that. "Lily," I said. "Yeah, Dad. I don't want the wheelchair today." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay." Her voice was careful in the way voices get when a person is trying not to let hope arrive too quickly in case it has to leave again. "Help me up," I said. "I want to walk out of here." The hardest part was not the standing. The hardest part was the moment before the standing, the moment when I shifted my weight forward in the wheelchair and placed my left palm flat on the edge of the defense table and understood, with the complete clarity that comes from inhabiting an injured body for 6 months, that what I was about to ask of my legs was going to hurt, and that I was going to ask it anyway. Lily had positioned herself to my left without being asked. Her hand was braced against the armrest of the chair, her right arm angled out at the precise angle of someone who has calculated exactly how much support to offer without taking over. Webb had quietly rolled the wheelchair back to give me room. Neither of them spoke. The courtroom had emptied around us, Greer had gathered his files and gone, the clerks had disappeared through the side door. The gallery was vacant except for Pastor Glenn, standing at the rear aisle with his hands at his sides and his dark blue jacket buttoned, watching with the particular stillness of a man who knows that what is happening does not require his commentary. I gripped Lily's forearm with my right hand. I pushed. The resistance came immediately, not sharp pain, not yet, but the deep pressurized refusal of joints that had been stationary too long. Tendons that had been protected and braced and carefully managed for 6 months and were now being asked to do the work they were built for before they had fully remembered how. My left knee was the loudest about it. A hard internal objection that traveled up through my thigh and into my hip and back down to my ankle in the space of half a second. I kept pushing. The leg held. I was upright. Not the way I had been upright for 4 decades on the floor of my shop, moving between machines and workbenches and storage bays without a single conscious thought about the mechanics of standing. This was deliberate and effortful and slightly precarious and entirely mine. Lily's forearm was steady under my grip. I could feel her working to keep herself from tightening her hold, the small muscular effort of a person who wants very badly to do more than they have been asked to do. "You good," she said. Her voice had gone thin at the edges. "Ask me in about 30 feet, I said. She exhaled not a laugh exactly, but the near neighbor of one, the kind of sound that lives just on the other side of tears and chooses at the last moment not to cross over. We started moving. The first step was the worst one. It is always the worst one. And not only because of the pain, though the pain was present and specific and not something I will minimize. It was the worst because it required a form of trust that 6 months of careful managed recovery had been quietly training me out of the full committed transfer of weight onto a limb that had failed me once already in a way that had cost me more than I had yet finished counting. The braces would hold, the bone had healed, the physical therapist had cleared me for weight bearing weeks ago. All of that was true, and none of it made the first step feel safe. I took it anyway. The second step was better. Not good. I want to be accurate about this, but measurably better than the first, and in the mathematics of recovery, measurably better, is the entire vocabulary of progress. The third step was better than the second. By the fourth, I had found something close to a rhythm, slow and deliberate, and nothing like what walking used to feel like, but functional, which was the only thing it needed to be. We moved down the center aisle of the empty courtroom. The morning light had shifted since the hearing began coming now, from a lower angle through the east windows, laying long, pale rectangles across the wooden floor that we walked through one by one. I noticed things as we passed them, the worn edge of the gallery rail, a scuff mark on the floor near the third row. The particular quality of silence a room acquires when the proceedings that gave it purpose have concluded, and it has returned to being simply a room. Pastor Glenn fell into step beside us at the rear of the gallery without ceremony or announcement. One moment he was standing at the aisle end, and the next he was moving with us, his pace adjusting to mine, with the natural ease of someone who has walked alongside people who needed patience for a long time and no longer has to think about how to do it. We walked in silence for a few steps. Then he said, "Eleanor's putting a pot roast on when I get home." I said, "Glenn." He said, "Yeah." I said, "Give me about 3 more seconds before you mention food." He made a sound low in his chest, warm and unhurried, and said nothing further. Just walked. That was the entirety of what I needed from him at that moment, and he had understood it without being told, which was the thing about Glenn Whitaker that 30 years of living across the street from him had never made ordinary. Webb was at the courtroom door. He had his briefcase in one hand and his jacket folded over his arm, and the particular expression of a man who has completed the work he came to do and is allowing himself quietly to register that fact. He held the door without making a production of it. As I passed him, he said, "Property transfer documents will be at Lily's address by Friday. You don't need to come into the office." A pause. "Robert," I stopped. "It was the right outcome," he said. 3 years ago, I might have expected congratulations from an attorney at a moment like this. What Webb offered was something different and more considered the judgment of a man who had watched enough proceedings go wrong to understand that the right result was not guaranteed, and that when it arrived, it deserved to be named accurately. "Yes," I said. "It was." He stepped back. We went through the door. The corridor outside was empty and fluorescent lit, and smelled of copy paper and old carpet and the particular institutional neutrality of a building that processes human difficult as a matter of daily routine, and is not changed by any of it. Our footsteps were the only sound. Lily stayed at my side, her arm available, her pace precisely matched to mine. She was not looking at me. She was looking forward at the end of the hallway at the elevator doors, giving me the specific privacy of not being watched. That is one of the more useful things a person can offer someone who is doing something hard. In the elevator, we did not speak. The lobby was marble floors and low voices, and the ordinary business of a courthouse on an ordinary morning, people moving through with folders and briefcases, and the focused expressions of individuals who had places to be that had nothing to do with Callaway versus Callaway. We moved through them, and they moved around us, and the world continued its indifference to the specific weight of what we were carrying out through those front doors. I saw the glass doors ahead. Through them, the top of the courthouse steps and the street below, and the March sky above, not the flat white of the previous afternoon, but something newer, the sky in the process of deciding to be blue. Lily pushed the left door open and held it. The cold came in first, a clean, sharp March cold that found the gaps at my collar and wrists, and reminded me without ceremony that it was still winter in Winston-Salem, regardless of what had just happened inside that building. I stepped through the doorway and onto the top landing, and the cold air hit my face fully, and I stood there for a moment with the city in front of me. 4 steps to the sidewalk. The handrail was on my right. I took it. The first step down was different from the steps inside. The angle engaged different muscles, put different demands on the left knee, required a recalculation of the balance I had been building over the previous 100 feet of corridor. My ankle brace pressed against my calf in a way that would leave a mark. The cold had found the old fracture sites and was making its presence known in each of them with a specificity that was almost informative. I took the second step, the third, the fourth. My feet found the sidewalk on North Church Street, both of them flat, and even the weight distributed across the braces and the healed bone and the muscle that had spent 6 months rebuilding itself toward this moment, without knowing that this was the moment it was rebuilding toward. I released the handrail. I stood without holding anything. Beside me, Lily made a sound brief and involuntary and impossible to prepare for, even when you have been hoping to hear it. She pressed both hands against her mouth, and her shoulders moved once sharply. And then she pulled herself back from whatever edge she had reached, the way she always pulled herself back from some place in her that was deeper than anything the last 6 months had touched. I looked down North Church Street. Traffic, bare trees, ordinary people walking to ordinary places in ordinary morning light that was going slowly and without drama from pale to blue. I had lost a great deal in this city. I had kept more. I was standing on a public sidewalk on a Tuesday morning in March on my own 2 feet with the work waiting. That I decided was enough to begin with. 6 months later, the sign above the workshop door still said, Callaway Iron Works. Same rusted letters, same slight leftward lean that I had always meant to correct and never gotten around to. The September morning light came across it at a low angle, finding the old weld lines and making them visible the seams where the metal had been joined 4 decades ago by a 26-year-old man whose hands were shaking with something that was not quite fear and not quite courage, but lived in the narrow territory between them. I had stood in this parking lot on Industrial Drive hundreds of times over 40 years, without giving that sign more than a passing glance. That morning I stood and looked at it for a long time. I was not using the wheelchair. I had not used it since the courthouse steps on North Church Street in March, when Lily had held the glass door open, and I had walked through it into the cold air with both feet and both legs, and the metal braces doing the quiet mechanical work that my joints were not yet ready to do without help. The braces were still there every morning, both legs the familiar weight of them, that had become as unremarkable as the weight of my work boots. The left knee still registered cold mornings before the thermometer did. The right hip had developed opinions about rain that I had not asked for and could not ignore. But I was standing in my parking lot on a September morning without holding on to anything, and the sign above the door was right where I had left it, and that was more than enough to begin a day with. I walked inside. The shop floor had its smell back. That was the thing I had noticed first when I returned in late May after the property transfer was finalized, and Webb had handed me the keys that had been in Evelyn's possession since the accident. Metal and machine oil, and the dry, particular warmth of equipment that has been running long enough to reach operating temperature. Smells do not lie about a place the way appearances can. The smell of Callaway Iron Works told me before I had looked at a single contract or reviewed a single account that the building knew what it was for and had been waiting to get back to it. 3 overhead cranes were moving. Danny Reeves, 26, whom I had hired out of a vocational program at Forsyth Tech in August, was checking tolerances on a bracket batch for a construction firm in Greensboro, moving with the careful, deliberate attention of a young man who has learned enough to know how much he does not yet know, which in my experience is the most useful stage of development a machinist can occupy. He reminded me of myself at that age in ways I had not mentioned to him, because some things are more effective as observation than as compliment. 2 other machinists I had brought on were running the CNC equipment on the south wall, their movements economical, and practiced the small adjustments of experienced hands. The east wall behind them was new construction rebuilt over the summer with engineering specifications. I had written myself certified by 3 independent inspectors, anchor plates rated to 4 times any load they would realistically carry. The engineer who installed them had looked at my specifications and said, with the careful diplomacy of a professional who has learned to accommodate clients with strong opinions, that the installation was going to be, and here he had paused, very thorough. I had told him that thorough was what I was paying for. I walked the floor the way I had always walked it before the accident, slowly before the full crew arrived, running my hand along the equipment, listening to the sounds the machines made. A well-running shop has a voice, and after 40 years, you learn to hear it the way you learn to hear anything that matters, not by trying, but by paying attention long enough that the knowing becomes automatic. Everything that morning had the right voice. I made a note about the tension on the east crane cable, which was due for inspection, and went to my office. Lily had reorganized the office over the summer. This was the most significant change in the building, and also the one that had taken me the longest to find the right way to think about. Evelyn had run this office for 18 years, and the traces of her organization system, the color-coded folders, the particular way the filing cabinets were arranged. The vendor contact sheets she had kept in a specific binder on the top shelf had been part of the fabric of the place for so long that their absence in the early months had felt like a different kind of wound than the legal and physical ones. Lily had not tried to erase the traces. She had simply replaced them with her own. The color-coded folders became a digital system on her laptop. The filing cabinets were reorganized around the current vendor relationships, which were different now because several of Evelyn's suppliers had been connected to the procurement fraud, and Sandra Mercer had helped identify clean alternatives during the spring audit. The binder on the top shelf held the new contract templates Webb's office had drafted. It was the same shelf, different knowledge sitting on it. I poured coffee from the machine Lily had installed, a proper one, which produced something that tasted like coffee rather than like the ancient percolator's output, which I had consumed for 20 years, under the impression that suffering through bad coffee was a character-building exercise, and had since revised that opinion entirely. I sat at my desk and looked at the order board. 14 active contracts, 3 pending. A structural firm out of Durham had called the previous week about a long-term fabrication partnership for a multi-year construction project, and I had taken that call myself, sitting at this desk with a notepad writing down numbers and timelines and requirements while the morning light moved across the floor outside my office window. The pipeline was not what it had been at its peak. That would take more time, and I had made my peace with the timeline because I had learned in the months since March that some things could not be rebuilt quickly without being rebuilt wrong. Sandra Mercer had untangled the accounts over the spring with the same methodical precision she had brought to the conference table in February. What she found once the fraudulent disbursements were stripped away and the legitimate operating costs were properly categorized was a business that had been more financially sound than it appeared, because Evelyn had been drawing money out of it for nearly 2 years, and a business that can survive that kind of sustained drain for that long has something real underneath the damage. But that had been good to know. Around 9 o'clock, Pastor Glenn's pickup truck slowed on Industrial Drive. I looked up from the desk and watched through the window as he stopped at the edge of the parking lot and sat there for a moment, the engine idling, looking at the sign above the workshop door with the expression of a man doing a private accounting of something that matters to him. Then he looked toward the building and found me through the window, which took him about 3 seconds, the way it always takes people 3 seconds to realize someone is looking at them from a lit room, and he raised one hand in the slow, deliberate wave of a man who has somewhere to be, but wanted to mark the moment of having driven past. I raised my hand. He drove on. I had spoken with Webb in August about the criminal proceedings. Evelyn's case had been assigned a trial date in the following April. The charges included procurement fraud, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, and one count that the district attorney had added in June based on the engineering analysis, a charge related to the deliberate creation of hazardous working conditions resulting in serious injury. Webb had explained the specifics with his usual precision, and I had listened and asked the questions I needed to ask, and then told him that I trusted him to keep me informed of the material developments and did not need to track every procedural motion. He had said that was a reasonable position. Brandon had entered a cooperation agreement with the district attorney in late March. His attorney had negotiated it, carefully reduced charges in exchange for complete and detailed testimony about his involvement and his mother's planning. Webb had told me when I asked directly that Brandon's cooperation had been thorough. The agreement did not protect him from consequence. It shaped the form those consequences would take. I did not follow the details beyond that. That was not avoidance. It was a decision about where I was willing to put my attention, a resource I had learned in the months since the accident to spend with more deliberation than I had spent it for most of my life. Frank Delgado's letter had arrived in April. 2 paragraphs handwritten on plain paper in the careful, slightly formal script of a man who did not write letters often and was trying to get this one right. The first paragraph was an apology, direct and without qualification. The second paragraph said he understood if he never heard from me again. I had kept the letter in the top drawer of my desk beneath the notepad I used for daily task lists. On the mornings when I thought about what it meant to carry a mistake for a long time and then do the difficult thing, not the easy thing, not the safe thing, but the right thing, late and imperfectly and at real cost to yourself. I thought about Frank Delgado. I had not yet written back. I was not certain what to say that would be both true and useful, but I had not thrown the letter away, and that felt like its own kind of answer. Lily arrived at 8:57, which was 3 minutes earlier than her usual Saturday arrival, because the Q3 report was due to the accountant the following Tuesday, and she had told me the previous weekend that she wanted to finish the review before lunch. She set her bag on the chair by the door, poured herself a coffee, and looked at me across the office with the particular evaluative attention she had been directing at me since the third morning in the hospital. The look of a person taking inventory of someone they have decided they are responsible for, not because they were told to be, but because they made that decision themselves and have not unmade it. "How's the leg?" she asked. I thought about the honest answer, which had more than one true component. "Cold morning," I said. "It knows?" She smiled at that, the full smile, the one that reached her eyes, the one I had not seen often enough in the months of hospitals and courtrooms and recovery, and had been seeing more frequently since May. She sat down at her desk and opened her laptop, and the small vertical line appeared between her eyebrows. That meant she was concentrating, and I turned back to my notepad and the Durham project and the first number I needed to write down to begin building what came next. Outside, the sign above the workshop door caught the morning light. The weld lines were visible, the lean was uncorrected. The letters spelled out the name of something that had been built by hand and had been tested by more than I had ever expected to test it, and was still standing still, operating, still taking on work on a September morning in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I had never gotten around to fixing the lean. I had decided in March, standing on a sidewalk on North Church Street, with my daughter beside me and my legs under me, that I never would. Some things you leave the way they are not because you forgot to fix them, but because fixing them would change what they mean. The lean in that sign was 40 years old. It had been there since the morning I welded those letters onto that piece of steel with shaking hands in a parking lot that was only half paved, and a business that existed more in my intention than in any observable reality. It had survived everything that sign had survived. It had earned its lean. Looking back at my shattered life this September, this raw family story taught me that blind trust can completely blind you to reality. I survived a horrific family betrayal that almost cost my life. Don't be like me. Don't let unconditional love silence your instincts or cause you to ignore the subtle warning signs in your own home. Personally, I believe that true love should never lack accountability, and true partners don't keep secrets. God knows I only survived this ordeal because of Lily's fierce loyalty. Every painful family story has a definitive turning point, and ours was uncovering the dark truth behind that collapsed scaffolding. This isn't just a dramatic family story of greed. It's a harsh lesson on overcoming a deep family betrayal. Money can corrupt even the closest bonds, but embracing the truth ensures you stand tall after a devastating family betrayal. What would you do in my shoes? Please leave your thoughts in the comments, share this video with others, and subscribe to our channel for more profoundly moving narratives. Thank you so much for following my journey until the very end. Warning: the upcoming stories on this channel may contain fictionalized elements tailored for educational purposes. If you prefer not to listen to these dramatized lessons, please feel free to exit and select alternative content better suited to your preferences.